In this ClimateGenn episode, I speak with Dr Delton Chen, the originator of the Chen Paper concept, made famous by Kim Stanley Robinson in his book Ministry for the Future. Delton is an engineer by training, but has taken almost a decade out to study economics to see if his carbon reward coin concept, the idea of a reward for mitigating carbon, could provide the missing link needed to rebalance the human economy. The global reward coin would be backed by central banks around the world in order to provide stability and a mechanism to account for what he calls the living systems economy. By making a comparative analysis of this concept with other economic proposals, Delton asserts that degrowth and other circular economy proposals are inadequate to solve the climate emergency when placed in the context of the current paradigm of human civilization. Please do comment or send feedback, as I will be interested to hear what people think. Also, thank you for listening and subscribing. If you do want to support this work, then please share the episode on whatever available channel. Also, you can back it on Patreon. Thank you. Okay, Delton, it's very good to speak to you. I just want to start by asking you, I know a lot of people have heard about the global reward coin. Can you start with, just for some context, just give an elevator pitch, just explaining what it is and how it be created, maintained, distributed, etc.?
Yeah, sure, Nick. Thanks for inviting me to talk. The policy is called a global carbon reward, and the instrument is called a carbon currency. And the way it works is that we create a new market-based policy with a positive price for mitigated carbon. So think of it as the reverse of the tax for carbon emissions. So we're sort of filling the mirror image. However, through an analysis, what I claim is that this policy, which is market-based, offering a debt-free reward, it's not funded via fiscal policies, and that's why it's quite unique. Noting that we have an instrument which we call a carbon currency, or carbon coin if you like, this currency and its value will be managed with monetary policy. So we take the responsibility for managing the value outside of government, and we put it into a new institution, an international institution. Notionally, I call it the Carbon Exchange Authority. It would be given authority under the UN FCCC, probably. It would then do all the analyses to determine what price we should be offering as a reward, the carbon reward. And also it will determine and manage all the rules for issuing the carbon currency as an incentive. So there'll be a rule book. However, what's unique is that the value of the currency will be supported by central banks. And ideally, it will be all the world's central banks, at least the major ones, but ideally all of them. And one of many advantages is that this policy does not require any direct costs on governments, businesses, or citizens to fund it. We can actually fund the whole policy through currency trading and through a central bank guarantee for a floor price for the carbon currency. Now, obviously, this sounds relatively complicated or sophisticated, but I also claim that this policy is a fundamental policy, and it fits into a set of policies where there are four primary policies. One is a carbon tax, the other is a carbon subsidy, which is fiscal. That's a stick and a carrot. So the subsidy is a carrot, the tax is a stick. And there's another pair of carrots and sticks. The stick is cap and trade, and the carrot is the global carbon reward with this carbon currency. And this theory around these four market policies is called the carbon pricing matrix, and it's available on our website for people to read. So what's interesting about it is we're completing a set of social relationships and social agreements and biophysical relationships that will maximize the probability of achieving the Paris goals and achieving a functional, coherent economy.
I think the key differentiator, because there's a lot of carbon coins out there now, and they've been around. I mean, I saw some launched back in 2017, did some interviews around that, and even in Glasgow. The key differentiator that I can see is this sort of global involvement of central banks. Can you sort of just highlight how this really does differentiate from all these other coins out there, which are good entrepreneurial ideas?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think it's a very positive development that a lot of people are coming up with their own coins or NFTs or tokens or blockchains or something like that. And they're thinking, how can we monetize carbon? So they might come up with a scheme for putting carbon offset credits onto a blockchain, trading them in voluntary markets or compliance markets, or they might come up with something new. I'm not familiar with all of them. I think there is maybe too much optimism, a bit of magical thinking going on here that we could simply create a cryptocurrency or private unit of account and expect the world to buy it or want to buy it to the tune of $3, $4, $5 trillion per year. Not only do we need 3 to 6 trillion per year to effectively pay for an energy transition, a clean energy transition and carbon emission reductions, we're also going to need possibly as much as $100 trillion more for carbon removal this century, assuming that we are actually going to try to stay under 1.5 degrees. So the point here is that even the most optimistic policy toolkits are likely to result in emissions that will exceed the carbon budget for 1.5 degrees. So pulling back carbon out of the atmosphere does become an important future task. However, who's going to pay for it? Are we going to tax people to pay for it? How do you justify it? Because it's someone else's emissions. Now, the policy that I put forward, I believe it resolves these funding questions, not just around carbon credits and paying for carbon removal and carbon mitigation, but what it's doing, in my opinion, it's completing the theory on the market failure. So those people listening who are interested in the economics of climate change, you would have heard of the term market failure. Now, the standard definition of the market failure in carbon is that the damages created by emissions cause harm to us economically. And it's computed to be the social cost of carbon. So the way economists understand this is that they want to raise the carbon tax to match that social cost of carbon. You see, it's an example of cost-benefit analysis. You match the costs with the benefits. It's a very common sense approach. It is logical, and that's the standard theory for how to develop and justify a carbon tax. So what's quite unique about the global carbon reward policy is the theory underneath it. And the theory says that the climate crisis, the market failure in carbon, is not like any other market failure we've experienced. You know, we've had market failures in ozone depleting substances, mercury poisoning, sulfate emissions. There'd be others as well. Now, why is it different? Well, what I claim is that carbon's physical properties and chemical properties make it distinctly different to most other pollutants. Focusing on carbon, I think anyone with a rudimentary training in biology should know that life is carbon-based. So carbon is cycling through this very complex biological cycle, as well as going in the atmosphere. How do you explain that? How do you explain it if you're an economist? Well, you can't. That kind of complexity can only really be understood from biology, physics, and thermodynamics. And so we have, I think, the problem of the theory hasn't caught up to the complexity of carbon. What's my point? Well, my point is this. I believe that to control carbon and the carbon cycle, we need to treat it as a thermodynamic problem. And thermodynamics is very clear about controlling systems. The thermodynamic theory says you need 3 controllers because we have 3 governing boundaries, if you like, to this problem. In physics, it's conservation of energy, increasing entropy, and the energy boundary of the whole system of the Earth. So we need 3 controllers at a minimum. So my claim is that if we look for 3 controllers, climate problem and the carbon balance, I claim that 2 of those controllers are a stick, that's a negative price on carbon, a carrot, which is a positive price on mitigated carbon, and then the third is managing solar radiation directly, which is directly interfering with the Earth's albedo. So they're your 3 controllers from a systems perspective. 1 is negative price or tax on carbon emissions. 2 is a positive price or reward for mitigated carbon. And 3, solar radiation management. So if that's true, how do we explain to economists the second price signal, the carrot? Well, what I claim is that in a social framing, in an economics discussion, what we describe here actually is risk. So systemic risk, I believe, does have a biophysical explanation. And I also believe that the social cost, which is the standard theory, also has a biophysical explanation. Now, here, I'm just trying to point out that in the entire narrative on climate change policy, and if you read the latest IPCC report, AR6, the word risk is appearing so frequently now. How do we manage the risk, the risk, the risk? Which is interesting because the standard theory on carbon pricing is not about risk. It's about cost. How do we manage the cost? So we have two fundamental concepts, costs and risks. And that hasn't really been explained properly in terms of market theory. Hence, I put forward the argument we need to go to this carbon pricing matrix, which explains how all this fits together. So what is fascinating, I think, about the global carbon reward is the way it does manage risk and the way it seems to resolve some of the most intractable problems. And I think one of these problems that, Nick, you might agree with is that a lack of cooperation at the governmental level. You know, we'll point our fingers at politicians and say this politician, that country aren't pulling their weight. And so if we were to look behind the scenes, I would guess that the politics is about money. It's about industries protecting themselves as well as lots of other reasons too, but often it's short-term profit motives. So if we can fund this reward through monetary policy via the central banks of countries, there is no direct cost for the private sector. It's funded through, as I said, currency trading and monetary policy. And there's no direct costs for governments either. So the governments will be in a much better position because they don't have to stress out so much about their fiscal budgets. They can be confident that there will be a reward price for mitigating carbon, and it will be calibrated to the Paris goals. So governments can focus just on doing their regular budgeting. They can include carbon taxes wherever they can, cap and trade wherever they can, without stretching it so far that it could threaten their political futures. So it's easy to say, oh, let's raise the carbon tax or cap and trade or what have you. But I think we've seen examples where people have fought back against rising taxes on fuels, for example. The European Union, I think the Yellow Vest demonstrations was somehow related to taxes on diesel fuel. And now we see with the conflict in Europe, a rising price of fossil fuels, and it creates social unrest. Now, obviously, we don't want that. So for businesses, there's no direct cost for them. And for citizens, no direct cost. We can fund it through currency trading. And the amazing thing or the beautiful thing about it is that the carbon currency becomes an investment vehicle. So with the central bank guarantee, it will encourage the private sector to buy the currency. And through that mechanism, we're effectively funding this through private money, at least for the period of time when the value of the carbon currency needs to rise high enough to mitigate emissions to achieve the Paris goals.
The other thing that you talked about is that this is kind of almost a parallel to the current system. So you talked about the biophysical side and what you've called the living system economy.
Yes, I could explain that. Actually, that might be an easier way to explain the conceptualization.
So the living system economy kind of sits above the global carbon reward and the kind of fiat system. Can you talk a little bit how that works? Because I think it kind of illustrates it very well.
Basically, if we need to explain what's going on with the market failure in carbon, we do need a conceptual model that's relatively easy to understand. And I'll explain it this way. The difference between the living systems economy model and most other models that you see is quite straightforward if we just acknowledge the living systems economy approach has two systems, two economic systems. They're complementary to each other. Whereas conventional models, theories, policies, and what have you, look at the world economy as one system. It's an aggregation of all of the currency systems of 195 countries, I think, in the world. And so there's going to be at least 150 or more currencies. So that's the world economy. And interestingly, is all those currencies are actually fiat currencies, meaning they're legally declared into existence and they have a ledger and so on and so forth. They're created through commercial banking and by central banks. Now, the living systems economy approach simply says this system as a super system or super organism or whatever you want to call it, a biophysical system, it's emerged and evolved over time for a certain purpose. And that purpose is that it's evolved to become a heat engine. Why? Because its purpose through self-organization is to produce goods and services. So it's evolving for that reason. And producing goods and services technically is doing work thermodynamically. You need energy, and anything that can be combusted, be it biofuel or fossil fuels, is very, very handy for that kind of system, just like a steam engine. So my point is, we have an economy that has certain kinds of relationships, both monetary, financial, legal, social, cultural, even psychological and educational, that are biased towards working as a heat engine. So if we are trapped by that system, which apparently we are, that's how I would explain why our emissions have been increasing for decades. There is no way out of that. That system is very hard to decarbonize because of the entrained network effect and the relationships. They're resistant to rapid change. You can change them marginally. You can change them maybe, I don't know how much, but to change those relationships so quickly that we could go to net zero by 2050 seems improbable to me. So the natural solution under the living systems economy approach says, follow the way nature deals with this. Nature deals with it by evolving another system which is specialized for what we would call mitigation, but really it's taking carbon out of the atmosphere. In the environment, it's known as photosynthesis. In ecosystems, it's photosynthesis. In ecosystems, the opposite is respiration. In our economy, we call it combustion. So in our economy, we need another economy that does something like photosynthesis, but we wouldn't call it that. We call it carbon removal, or we call it negative emissions technologies. There's a few other names.
Drawdown.
Greenhouse gas removal. Yeah, drawdown and mitigation as well, reducing emissions and clean energy production. So if we create a parallel economy that's specialized for those actions, to do that becomes quite feasible if you create a parallel currency. And it has the right unit of account, store of value, social agreements, and whatever else it needs to perform that function. So the global carbon reward, in my opinion, as a policy, it's really designed to create that parallel economy. That's what it is by definition, and as far as I understand. And this is why I think it has the greatest chance of helping us decarbonize quickly to avoid catastrophic global warming. So it's about probabilities. That's the way physics works. Actually, thermodynamics is all based on probabilities. But what we're talking about here is something quite more sophisticated than simply entropy. Entropy is not sophisticated enough as a concept. We're talking about structures that occur at very large scales, at planetary scales, as well as tiny little cells and organisms.
I think it does help to think of it in terms of this living systems economy. I think that's a good wrapper for it, if you like. And what you're really saying as well is that the other economic proposals, which are sort of the current paradigm, which has a lot of externalities which we're not dealing with, and that's the problem. Then you've got degrowth proposals, we've got circular economy, donut economics, all these things that are out there. But what you're saying is that you don't think they can work because the system is too complex. Is that right?
Partly that, and partly also that I don't believe that ecological economics as it stands today has actually achieved its goals. It's stuck in sort of a quandary where it's got some ideas, but it doesn't really use those ideas properly. It boils down to the details here. So take, for example, the steady state economy. It effectively does ignore entropy. Steady state is not a natural phenomenon. It's an idealization that was invented for simplifying thermodynamic problems. The circular economy has a similar issues. It ignores entropic effects. It doesn't take into account phase changes, solid liquid gas, or chemical reactions, or other entropic effects. If you look at the carbon cycle, which is the problem, it's very entropic. So I'll just make this point. Actually, you might find this helpful and interesting, and that is the most popular model today for the carbon balance is called the bathtub model. And the bathtub model says you have a bathtub, the water is analogous to carbon going in the atmosphere. The bathtub is the atmosphere. If you put carbon in and you take carbon out, or whatever it means, the balance tells you the rising concentration. Because as you might know, about 50% of the carbon going in that's man-made is coming out, it's being absorbed by the land and the ocean. That's the purpose of the bathtub model. But my point is that's not actually the physics. The physics of carbon in the natural carbon cycle is not driven by stocks and flows. The bathtub model is a stock and flow concept. Stocks and flows are the macroscopic concepts of matter. So, for example, stock and flow would be water flowing through a pipe from a reservoir to your house, or cargo on a truck or a train or a ship, barrels of oil, trucks full of lumber. That's all stock and flows. When you look at the physics of carbon and the fast carbon cycle, it's not that way. It's not driven by stocks and flows at all. It's driven by chemical reactions and phase changes. So there are no stocks and flows, actually. That's just a kind of misinterpretation. So, for example, when carbon goes from the atmosphere into the ocean, the process is called diffusion, which is understood at the molecular level. Similarly, diffusion of CO2 into plants, combustion, these are chemical reactions with specific understanding of entropy and energy that drives these processes. So stock and flow models don't really explain the carbon cycle. And so the real problem in economics today, ecological economics, is at the level of the conceptual model. So my claim is that if we were to take into account these entropic effects, we wouldn't really solve our problems simply by just pointing out what I just said. There's more to it. We need to understand how these entropic effects affect whole systems at the macroscopic level. And my claim is that there are some effects which are very profound and observable. And one such effect is that complex living systems, when they've evolved, they specialize. They specialize into either respiring cells and organisms or photosynthesizing cells and organisms. We could talk more about that, but the reason is, once again, it's to do with probabilities. An organic system, which is self-constructed from molecules, these molecular arrangements based on DNA and so on, are highly specialized to move a chemical reactions in a certain direction. If it's respiration, it's for that purpose. So it can't simply go in reverse. This is why in life itself, you'll have organelles and cells which are specialized for photosynthesis. We call them chloroplast in plants. And then you have other cells specialized for respiration and growth. So in plants and other complex life, it's mitochondria. Okay, so these are the specialized cells, and that's an example of what I'm talking about. Complex systems specialize thermodynamically. If we take that concept and can extrapolate that to the world economy, I think it makes sense. We need another economic system, a parallel one that's specialized for taking carbon out of the atmosphere and also helping to decarbonize the existing economy. It does sound a little bit maybe esoteric, but it has logic for another reason, and that's to address the problem of degrowth. So if you like, I'll just comment on degrowth. Degrowth has certain logic to it. My claim is that degrowth is not technically a natural process. It can be introduced, but it's not the best option if you try to implement it in itself, because you come into direct conflict with the self-interest of societies and nation states. So if you go to nature as an example, generally speaking, organisms don't voluntarily degrow. Degrowth is usually forced on an organism. The way nature deals with the carbon balance is not through degrowth, it's through symbiosis. So take a plant, for example. A plant, be it a tree or a small plant, if it's in a closed system, a terrarium, it can achieve carbon neutrality. But it's not through degrowth. It's through symbiosis between photosynthesis and respiration. They balance each other out. It's a mass and energy transfer. And I'm saying that that's the way we would manage these economies. It's a parallel economy, the global carbon reward market, and the existing economy, which is really a heat engine for producing goods and services. So in this rebalancing, what happens is we use the exchange rate of the carbon currency as the governor, the controller, that sends energy and resources from the existing economy into our mitigation economy. And we just use the exchange rate as a controller. We either increase the exchange rate or decrease it as much as we need to rebalance what's happening in those two economies to achieve carbon neutrality or even carbon drawdown, if that's what's desirable. So it's about understanding that systems are not as simple as a steady state or circular economy when it comes to carbon. Carbon's really quite much more sophisticated than that. Keeping in mind, if you look at the planet, everyone would acknowledge that life on Earth is very complex. It's not single system spinning around like a wheel. There's a lot more going on there.
Quite often when we talk about these things, they kind of end up sounding very theoretical and very detached, you could say. And give us some context. I mean, the Tyndall Centre released a paper a couple of weeks ago, or last week maybe, saying that we have a 50% chance of staying below 1.5 degrees if we phase out coal fully in developed countries by 2030 and 2040 in developing countries. I mean, these are very stark numbers. The whole report is quite stark, really. And it's stark because although the advice is good, and if it was all hands on deck, we could probably get somewhere close to it. But the idea that our leaders will actually slip into emergency mode and do it is a complete fantasy. And I think that's how most people feel, that we're fantasizing by thinking they'll do it. How would can your proposal plug in to meet that challenge?
Yes, I think it's worth commenting on how I conceptualize the political elite or the government. Because, for example, if we're going to outlaw coal through austerity, one might assume a command and control policy might do the trick, a new law, for example, global law. Why can't we implement that? Why is it so difficult for the governments in the world simply to say, oh, let's stop burning coal? It's a good idea. It's probably because the system, as I was describing it, isn't really controlled from a few elite. It is a self-organizing system. It's very big with a lot of actors, billions of people. So if you think of the politicians and political leaders as not being necessarily at the top of a pyramid, they really have people behind them who they owe favors to. Okay, so they need to keep their support base happy, otherwise they'll lose power. So governments aren't really totally autonomous and in control to make extreme decisions unless they have enormous support from bottom up as well. Basically, I'm saying this, Nick, I think that the top-down command and control will help. It has a certain probability of success, but I don't think it'll be sufficient to achieve the radical exponential decarbonisation that we would need, because that kind of experience would need an exponential societal change where everybody feels compelled to participate and be part of a new way of living. One analogy is, it's not a good analogy, but it is one, is going to war. If for some reason war does motivate a lot of people, particularly young men who become very nationalistic, but nationalism isn't going to do it for climate. We need something else that does actually correlate to mitigation. So my argument is that a global carbon reward has a pretty good chance, in my thinking, to mobilize exponential societal change, because it synergies with our need to make a profit. We all need to make a living. It will create jobs and new opportunities, and it will allow the entrepreneurs and the problem solvers to find solutions. Also, Wall Street, I think, will really get behind it because we're creating a new investment vehicle and it's voluntary participation. So companies that want to decarbonize, they could potentially earn very large amounts of carbon currency. So their share price will rise and then more investors will pile in. We could create kind of like a new gold rush for carbon. And I think the people who were developing cryptocurrencies, and still are, or other tokens and things, are hoping to kind of create that new gold rush. However, I think to really move markets, we're going to need a central bank guarantee. I don't think kind of another Bitcoin experience is going to be arriving anytime soon for saving the climate. I think we need central banks to get behind it in a very structured way, where they're given a very specific mandate to manage the systemic risks of climate change. And not just from the point of view of financial risk, which is their current mandate. I'm saying that they really need to be involved in mitigating the upstream biophysical risks by actually funding this mitigation effort, which we could discuss, or people go to the website to see how it works.
I think that's been a really good introduction. And I think also you've had a good boost from Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry for the Future book. I'm gathering that central banks aren't queuing up to implement the plan just yet, but can you talk about that? What is your implementation strategy from where you're sitting right now?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Kim Stanley Robinson for writing the book and thinking about this policy as part of his story. He calls it Carbon Coin. Our plan currently is to raise money to do a demonstration of the global carbon reward policy. And the reason being is that simply publishing papers, which is important, doesn't really move mountains. So many papers are published in economics and climate that we need to do something much more visible at the same time. So the policy is still in stealth mode to a certain degree because we don't have any publications in the top level journals on climate policy. That's still coming. We haven't even released our first white paper, which is a work in progress, but we hope to release a white paper this year through a think tank. And if we get that out and we raise money for the demo, we'd like to involve a couple of governments in the demonstration. And really the challenge is taking this policy and putting it on the table for economists and central bankers to think about. And once it's in the narrative, then my prediction is that it will feed on itself, because we have a need. We have a need to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. And I think many scientists are saying that the rate of global warming and extreme weather changes is faster than was predicted only, say, 10 years ago. Maybe it's not that surprising for some of us, but my prediction or forecast is that will always be the case. We'll always be kind of behind the game because the climate system, Earth systems, have complexity and tipping elements and positive feedback. So we can't expect the climate to be stable just because we have computer models that say otherwise. So if we have more heat waves and extreme weathers coming up, I'm sure we will in the next few years, 5 years or so, that'll put much more pressure on governments and central bankers to think outside the box. So we need some real outside the box thinking, because this policy is really asking the central bankers to change their philosophy. Their philosophy is that they don't see a role to directly fund climate mitigation to achieve the Paris goals. As far as they're concerned, it appears that they believe it's government's responsibility. And so this is really the crux of the matter. Who is responsible for the climate risk at the end of the day? Is it the government and their fiscal budget? Is it the private sector? Is it the central banks, or is it someone else? According to the analysis I've done, I claim it sits with the central banks in combination with a new institution that we don't have. So I claim we need an international institution called the Carbon Exchange Authority that really runs this carbon exchange. It's a standard for carbon that gives rewards, financial rewards for mitigated carbon. Now, if this works, in my mind, it resonates, it makes sense, because we as a civilization, we as a species, we are never going to have a planet Earth without a climate problem, because we're always going to be interfering with the carbon cycle. And now that we've got all this technology and we can burn things so easily, it's always going to be a problem for us forever. So we need a really forever solution, a really well-structured institution that can properly respond to these systemic risks with price signals that everyone can agree with. It's not going to upset countries or people. And I think the global carbon reward could likely meet that need. Not on its own. We also need all the other policies, and there are many, including ecocide laws, Green New Deals, carbon taxes, cap and trade, and regulations and standards. So it's not A or B. We're putting forward an A, B, and C and D, E, F. But the policy called the Global Carbon Reward, what I think currently is that this is the policy that is needed to really shift the probabilities, and for the reasons I've tried to explain.
That's really fascinating. So thank you very much for taking the time to speak to me, and I'm sure we'll be speaking again.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks for being so patient listening to me.
Thanks again for listening. If you are interested to help support this series and help expand the discussion around climate topics, then please do consider backing my channel via Patreon. It will help me produce more content, and you will also gain access to more expert interviews. It would be great to engage more with audiences too and understand your views on these topics.